This is just the beginning.
Welcome to Anti-Asian Violence in America's virtual event. I'm Nyla Boodoo, host of the Axios Today podcast, coming to you from Axios headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. Welcome to our audiences on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Axios.com. And you can join the conversation today on Twitter using the @Axios handle or #Axios events. Over the next half hour, I'm going to be joined by my colleagues, Sarah Kehaulani-Gu and Hope King, to unpack the recent upswing in anti-Asian violence and the social and political movements affecting national discourse, with a lens to how activists are and have been shaping this conversation. Our first guest is Michigan State Senator of Senate District 1, Senator Stephanie Chang, joining us from Detroit, Michigan. Senator Chang, welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too. Now, I wanted to go back to before you were elected back in 2014 to the Michigan House. You were the first Asian American woman to do so, but I wanted to go back to before that, to your roots as a community organizer, including your work with the civil rights icon, Grace Lee Boggs. And I wonder what influence she had on the beginning of your career and your activism.
Yeah, well, I tell people that, I think what's amazing is that Grace and being around her in my first 2 years living in Detroit, I think shaped a lot of who I am, as well as, my work as a community organizer and coalition builder. I think that I probably would be a different person if I had lived anywhere else when I first moved to the city of Detroit. And so, she and the people around her really taught me so much about grassroots organizing in Detroit, Detroit's history as a civil rights hub for so many years. And I think that has been something that I've been able to take with me as a public servant. So just really grateful for those years.
And what did you learn about coalition building during those years? And I'm thinking particularly coalition building between different communities of color across Detroit.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, not only working with Grace, but also a lot of coalition building work that I did around affirmative action, around immigrants' rights issues, voting rights, criminal justice reform, basically in the years of organizing before running for office. I have continued to learn about, how do we connect with people? How do we figure out what is it that is going to make someone interested in an issue? How are we going to connect with someone who maybe hasn't thought about this issue? And how do we broaden coalitions effectively? And I think really most importantly, how do we make sure that work is done in a multiracial way? And I think that has all sort of really led us to this moment. But I think it's been really powerful to be part of some really amazing multiracial coalitions. And as someone who is an Asian American in a district that in my House district was predominantly African American, and now my Senate district, a large African American community, large white downriver community, and large Latino community, I'm kind of an anomaly. So in a way, it's been a great experience to be able to actually help build bridges between many of the communities in my own district. So it's been a tremendous, tremendous experience so far.
I think so many times we focus on the divisions, and I wonder what lessons you can share from building those bridges, what you think we need to know about what that looks like, for example, among your constituency and the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's really important that we're always making connections between issues. So, whether it's, Stop Asian Hate or working on issues of racism and connecting them very much to Black Lives Matter, and also continuing the fight for immigrants' rights. I mean, I'm so lucky that I have some really amazing community activists in my district who have been working on a lot of tough issues for a very long time. So being able to sort of help uplift the work that they're doing, make those connections, and even just this coming Saturday, a group that I'm on the board for, Rising Voices of Asian American Families. We're doing a healing session together with Detroit Action and Healing by Choice, which is, really geared to be an Asian American and all Black, Indigenous, and people of color, a session for healing our own racial trauma and a dialogue. So I'm excited about that. And I think that we need more of that, especially given what's going on in our country.
When you're thinking about, you mentioned family, I wanted to ask you about your family, which is also biracial. What do you tell, for example, your children about this moment? I wonder how you're speaking to them about that.
Yeah, well, over this past year, I've had to explain to my older daughter, who's going to be 6 this August, about George Floyd in very simple terms about, the fact that there was a Black man who was shot or who was killed by the police, and that other officers didn't intervene. And she got it right away. And said, well, why didn't the good officers help or stop the bad officer from doing it? I mean, she gets it. And then, after the shooting in Georgia, having to explain that there were 6 Asian American women that were killed because of who they are. It was really hard to figure out what words to use, and I'm not honestly totally sure that I explained it in a way that really made sense. But she remembers, and she's been to several rallies with me that I spoke at over the past few weeks. And it's tough, and she's Asian and Black, and I want her to be proud of every ounce of who she is. And also want to make sure that she knows that she sees members of her community standing up for what they believe in and standing up for one another. So really trying to make sure that we get her to those spaces where she sees people that look like both parts of her working together and really trying to uplift issues around justice and around equity. So it's been quite the year for America. But I mean, certainly, I think for our family having to try to figure out, and so many other families having to try to figure out how do we talk about these things with our kids has been a little challenging.
Senator Chang, I wonder what it's like. I wonder if you can share how you feel in this moment as someone who spent your entire life working to advance issues, particularly among the Asian American community, but as we've just been talking about, all of these different communities of color. What is it like to have this moment where all of a sudden there's a spotlight on the Asian American community that really we've never experienced? I wonder how that feels to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a little bit of a roller coaster, I think an emotional roller coaster for so many in the Asian American community. And certainly I have felt that way of, so many moments of sadness and then anger. And then so many of us, Asian American women calling and texting each other to see how we're doing, knowing that so many of us, I think, are reliving moments of racism and sexism combined over our lifetimes. And I think it's really unfortunate that it took a mass shooting for much of America to wake up to the fact that there is a lot of anti-Asian sentiment that exists, and that it's not new in our country. But it's been interesting and a struggle, but also really inspiring to see some of the amazing activism, especially from younger people in the community that are just really rising up and speaking out. It's been really, really inspiring.
Well, Senator, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. Stephanie Chang is a state senator in Michigan. She represents Senate District 1. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
And next, we have a segment with my colleague, Sarah Kehalani-Gu.
Thank you. I'm Sarah Gu. I'm executive editor at Axios, and I'm happy to have as my next guest to introduce you to Amanda Nguyen. She's the founder and CEO of RISE, an organization that has been advocating to change laws on behalf of sexual assault victims. Amanda, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really interested to talk with you about anti-Asian violence because I'm really curious from where you sit. You have a lot of experience with people who have been victims of assault. In your experience with sexual assault, and trying to advocate on behalf of those victims. But now we're talking about a broader population. I'm wondering if you're seeing any parallels in terms of reluctance from victims to come forward.
Absolutely. Most justice issues, if not all, are intersectional. And as someone who has spent nearly a decade working on sexual assault survivor rights, I can say that there is similarities between sexual violence and what the victims of racism, especially anti-Asian racism, are experiencing. It is very well known that there is stigma that is attached to coming out as a rape survivor. Like myself, I'm a rape survivor. I also have lived in the skin as an Asian American for my entire life. And in my lived experience, because everyone's experience is different, but in my lived experience, I can say that I have had experiences where people within the community are hesitant to share about the racism that they've experienced because they don't think that it will be validated, because they don't think that there is nuance and space within our current dialogue about racism to account for what they have gone through. And I'm hopeful that in the moment we are in, we're starting to see this dialogue emerge and change.
Right. And I could definitely hear what you're saying there as an Asian American myself. I think that culturally there's some issues there with, a culture of not wanting to, stick out, not wanting to complain. I know that's not exactly the right word in this context here, but in other words, to make a fuss or to cause a disturbance. I think very strongly in Asian American culture and in Asian culture, it's about kind of fitting in, assimilating, having your work speak for itself, and not standing out. And I also think, though, that in what's happened since the Atlanta killings is a conversation that's been much broader and much more outspoken. And I'm interested in your thoughts about generationally, whether you think that there is a change going on right now.
There is undoubtedly a change that is going on right now. Younger AAPIs, Asian American Pacific Islanders, I have noticed, feel like they are rightfully entitled to the constitutional rights that are afforded to all Americans. There has been a theme of first-generation immigrants feeling like they need to assimilate and can't speak up because they just want to survive in a new country, in a new world. And that generational split, I think, has helped not only because of many people speaking up, but also because of social media democratizing access to resources and this idea that we are not alone.
Right. And I guess there's also been a lot of conversation about hate crimes and how we define that. I wanted to turn to that topic because in your organization, you have a lot of experience with legislation, passing laws to help victims of sexual assault. I'm interested in your thoughts about how we define a hate crime. Do you feel that it's adequate right now to address the incidents that we've seen over the past year and beyond against Asian Americans or other victims of hate?
Now, of course, there's a legal definition of what hate crimes constitute, but to be clear here, what is morally acceptable and what the law upholds are two different issues. That has been the history of what, well, frankly, democracy is, that we are an experiment and we consistently reiterate ourselves so that we make a more perfect union, right? So by acknowledging that as a starting point, what I want to say is that hate crimes may be defined certain ways on the state level, on the federal level differently. However, we must address unconscious bias, right? When people talk about hate crimes and trying to define, oh, was this person racist in their action? That, yes, has a legal, there are legal ramifications and consequences and definitions, but I don't want to conflate that with this very real unconscious racism that undoubtedly happens. And it's happened because of systemic oppression. What I mean by that is AAPIs for the history of us being in this country have been systematically erased from the narrative, from Hollywood to the federal government. In 2009, there was a study that showed that AAPIs don't even, in some agencies, aren't even included in the definition of racial minorities. In our education, our history isn't taught, our grief, our excellence. And of course, mainstream media doesn't cover our stories enough. All of these systems have a part to play in shaping the narrative of what it means to be an American, what it means to be Asian American, and all of this plays into unconscious bias.
Interesting to get your take on that, and the perspective of history for sure is important. One last thing I wanted to ask you about is there have been, as we've documented, other news organizations have documented, there have been these, what seems like random acts of violence across the country in different cities against elderly Asian Americans. It doesn't seem to have a rhyme or reason, but you talked about the underlying kind of racism against Asian Americans who don't feel seen or haven't been seen in some ways. I guess I'm wondering, what do you see as potential solutions to this? It does seem a bit unending. It's unclear before we can start to kind of put a solution forward, or you have to agree on kind of what the cause is. And I'm wondering how you're seeing it.
For me, it's quite simple. The problem is invisibility. Therefore, the solution is visibility. It means representation in all of these systems that I've mentioned, right? Hollywood, our federal government, representation, mainstream media, our education. So I want to ask, why isn't the education system in America teaching about AAPIs? Because at the heart of it is empathy. Right? In order for us to combat what's going on right now, we need to be seen in our full humanity. What was so terrible about one of those recent videos that went viral was this Asian woman who was violently beaten, and that there were bystanders that stood there and did nothing, right? For me, it was the bystanders that hurt so much, because it spoke volumes that they didn't come to a community member's aid. And if anyone were to watch that video, I think that they would agree that there were two crimes. One, which is the act of violence itself, and two, which is the choice to not do anything about it. And so for folks who are wondering how in this moment they can help, know that it is so incredibly important that you speak up at this moment. Speak us into the consciousness of this country, because it matters.
Thank you so much, Amanda. You clearly have a strong perspective, and thank you for bringing it to us today in this conversation. We really appreciate it.
Of course.
Next up, I'm going to turn to my colleague, Hope King. She's going to continue the conversation.
Hello, I'm Hope King, and I'm a business reporter at Axios. Now joining us from Houston, Texas, the executive director of Run AAPI, Linh Nguyen. Linh, so great to see you.
Hi, Hope. It's good to see you too.
Linh, you've been on the ground conducting outreach, mobilizing people, young voters, Asian Pacific Islanders, communities of color for years now. So I really want to start by asking how you're doing, how the past few months have been for you compared to the past few years.
Yeah. One, I appreciate you asking, Hope. It's still a hard question to answer. I think for a lot of us, it's having to almost relive a lot of our own trauma every single day. So there are days when I'm just so exhausted. Other days when you're feeling so much gratitude for our community, and days when we're just tired. So I mean, in this moment, I'm very thankful that this conversation is happening. I'm thankful that we have platforms like this, to have these conversations and to be real and honest with how a lot of us are feeling. But really, I'm tired. Today, I'm feeling pretty tired.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, you have been, as I mentioned, sort of on the ground, especially in some of these very key battleground states, and you're currently consulting with Governor Newsom's Office of Emergency Services. You were the AAPI coalition director for the Democratic Party of Georgia. You oversaw all the engagement with Asian Pacific communities during that runoff election period. Can you tell us right now what the state of voter engagement is in the AAPI community and how that engagement can or maybe can't help with addressing the trend of violence here that we're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, for a lot of us political organizers, movement organizers, community-based organizers, like these conversations and the realization of what anti-Asian violence and racism looks like, we've known this for years. We've felt this for years. And even for community members, we've always understood what this moment has meant for us and what it's felt like for us. But I think more specifically, in the electoral organizing space and like recognizing the power of Asian Americans, I still think, we've only been able to really recognize, the tip of the iceberg. Right. Like when it comes to real investment and the outreach and the strategies and bringing us on board and hiring us and giving us real budgets and real funding and resources, it takes long-term investment to actualize and galvanize this power. Right. And I mean, like I had such a tremendous privilege, having just recently worked in Georgia and like really intimately understanding, the community, the Asian Pacific diaspora in Georgia. And again, like some of the most resilient communities I've ever had a chance to work in was in Georgia. Like they were almost ready for this moment. And we really felt that in November of 2020 in the general election. But in the runoff election, you really see them come out and like taking care of their own and making sure we were just able to vote. Right. So I think we're still just kind of getting at the surface with really what organizing needs to look like.
Right. And some of that funding you mentioned in the past, translating materials into different languages for all the different cultures within the Asian community. A lot of that has to be done to even engage in the first place. But, I want to talk about something maybe that we haven't been talking about enough, and maybe it wasn't the right time. There's been a lot of pain in the community. There's been a time of grieving and mourning, but we did talk previously about maybe some of the tougher internal issues, maybe 3 of them that you feel like maybe now is the time to call out. What are they and why is it important to do so?
Right. It's, and again, a lot of us who identify as Asian, we've all like kind of understood this to some degree, and that, it's a lot of the issues, the racism, everything is just so deeply rooted in white supremacy. It's rooted in the system that's meant to oppress us, that's meant to pit us against one another. And these intersectional conversations we have a lot, really more like the insular, the political the political groups, folks that are really online, on Twitter, on Facebook. We see this dialogue happening a lot. But I think for a lot of us who are in the communities and organizing, these conversations also need to happen within our own families. I can't help but to think of like even like my own mom, who came over as a war refugee, who still almost embodies that almost like a survival mode, right? Like they like needing to like assimilate, almost forgetting where we came from, our roots, and like, again, like that anti-Blackness that still exists within our own people, right? And you're right, Hope, in that with everything that's been happening these last few weeks and, the xenophobia, the feeling of always being this foreigner in America, it's manifested in such grotesque and violent ways. And yet I feel like the conversation and what white supremacy is and how we got to this moment, it needs to happen at home. It needs to happen in the churches that we belong to, in the community centers that we go to, in like the restaurants, the local Asian restaurants that we support. But I feel like a lot of the conversations, if you're chatting with an everyday, neighbor, community member in Orange County or here in Houston, it's often hard to think that they're almost ready to have this dialogue.
And also internally, I mean, among the genders, right, in the community, I mean,
absolutely.
So much of the pain.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think a lot of folks are starting to see, and this is where like we, with the Stop Asian Hate hashtag, like you see a lot of new conversations happening, but you also see a lot of conversations that have been led by Asian women, right? Asian women who have been advocating for whether they're immigrant rights, reproductive justice rights. It's these conversations have. We want to see a lot more support from Asian men. And again, like these are conversations that often don't happen enough or aren't explicitly being said, but it's typically Asian women who are doing this work, who are willing to get on the ground. They're on the front lines, and yet there's again whether it's a gender divide, a generational divide, even within the umbrella of who identifies as Asian American Pacific Islander, but it's such a complicated space for so many of us that I truly feel like a lot of us organizers, we almost want to anchor this conversation in this moment and just almost redefining like what it means to be Asian today, what it means to be Asian in America, what it means to be Asian in southern states like Georgia, like Texas. But it's like now has been the moment for us to keep this as mainstream as possible. Like that has to be part of this. We have to keep talking about it.
Lynn, we have to leave it here for today, but we thank you so much for joining Axios.
Thank you so much, Hope.
And now I'd like to bring in Naila Boodoo and Sarah Gu for a Why It Matters segment. Welcome, Naila and Sarah.
Thank you, Hope.
Thanks, Hope. Before we even get to the Why It Matters, I know we also have some really great audience questions. Sarah, there was one that related a little bit to your conversation that you had.
Right. I'm so glad you brought this up. We got a great audience question about, how strong are the laws to prosecute incidents that we've seen over the past year plus that seem random, pushing over, assaulting Asian Americans on the street. And I think there was a question around how strong are the laws to prosecute crimes like this and how they're categorized? Naila, I wanted to know what you thought.
Yeah, I feel like we have to even take a step back and just go to the categorization into the data. And that's been a real problem. In fact, that was one of the parts of President Biden's executive actions that he issued around AAPI issues was just the data collection and making sure, first of all, there's not a standard definition, that we have a standard definition of hate crimes, that federal agencies are working with state and local agencies to collect this data, because that's something we don't even know. And Hope, I know this is something activists have really focused on as well, because the data isn't being collected by the government.
Data isn't being collected. It's hard to get people to respond to some of these census questions, for example, because there are so many languages within the Asian community. And so funding needs to be directed in those areas. And Lynn talked about this a little bit as well, having to fight for those funds to get those questions translated into various languages so that people can actually respond accurately in order to get the data to be collected.
One thing I wanted to bring up with you all was the role of Asian American women in this. And this is something I was discussing with Senator Chang previously. She wanted to highlight the role of not just Asian American lawmakers and encouraging other women to run for office, but Asian American activists in all of this. Hope, I know this came up in your conversation as well.
Yeah, I mean, Lynn mentioned this as an issue that is maybe now the time to bring up within the community, because there had to have been some time for grieving and mourning, but to gently call out those inside of the Asian community for continuing the tropes, for maybe continuing the hypersexualization of women, and really to acknowledge how much work they are doing, like she is doing on the ground doing this work. So I think she thinks that time has come now to address those things.
Right. And Naila, this came up in my conversation too, in a different way, with Amanda Nguyen, who, she's not even 30 years old and started this impressive organization advocating on behalf of sexual assault victims, and saw from her perspective a parallel here in the reluctance from victims to come forward. And what I think, we've all observed, unfortunately, because of a result of so many terrible incidents, but what we have seen is generational change here, where you see a much more active younger people, Asian Americans, speaking out, being much more active and outspoken on these issues than perhaps their parents or grandparents would have been.
There's a lot of intersectionality with all of this, which I think was another important part of the takeaways of our conversations today. Thank you, Sarah and Hope, for joining me, and thank all of you for joining us this afternoon for another virtual conversation that has made everyone smarter faster. If you'd like more information on Axios today, you can visit axios.com/podcast/today. You can also find us on the Axios app. Thanks, everyone, for joining. We'll see you on Axios.com.